So I've been waiting for a while to post a video like this. It's because I've run into this before and I really want everyone to heed this advice to avoid any issues when troubleshooting misfires. I've made it no secret that my first step for misfire troubleshooting is an RC test, which is a relative compression test. That is when we inhibit starting and we crank the vehicle over and use an amp clamp in order to compare the load that each cylinder puts onto the starter. Theoretically, if every cylinder is of the same compression, it will place an equal load to the starter between all cylinders. And when one is out of whack or low contributing or low compression, you will see a dip where it should be uneven pressure, even amperage placed to the starter. So I want to get to the point of the video, but before I do that, I am doing an RC test on this one. You know what, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. The advice is don't just trust an RC. That's the truth. You cannot just trust a cranking amperage test and walk away. What do I mean? Let's go ahead and crank this vehicle over. And you guys can listen for yourselves. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. I'm going to hold down the pedal. That gives us a clear flood option that inhibits starting and lets us crank only. So we're going to do key on, pedal all the way to the floor, and we're going to crank it. Now, some of you may have noticed a little bit of a waviness. That is because the way I set up the testing that I'm doing. That is nothing else. But if you hear it, if you let it stabilize and you give it after like about 5 seconds, it sounds perfectly even. This vehicle is suffering from a misfire only at idle. And I know a lot of you are gonna say, well, you already know what it is, this and that, but the reason why I say do not trust a relative compression test by itself is because I've been burned by doing that in the past, and now I can only trust a relative compression test along with an intake pulse. Let me show you why. So we have the vehicle set up and we've got our amp clamp right here on our positive wire. We've got our pulse sensor here, and we have a little T, right, with a little hole that is exposed to the atmosphere. The reason why that is because when we're doing clear flood, that throttle opens wide and it will skew our readings unless we have something to mimic a throttle body closed. Of course, this is a little smaller than an actual closed throttle body, so that's why we're getting a bit of a waviness. We got a bit of too much of a restriction in the air intake, and of course I've got my crankcase ventilation system isolated from our intake system. So the reason why I do that is to not get any false readings. If you were to get a let's say an anomaly on the intake pulse, but your crankcase is still connected to your intake, that could easily be cylinder wash, and it's just transferring that pulse over to your intake waveform. So you don't want to fall into that mess. Ask me how I know. So now I isolate the crankcase from the intake on every chance I get, whenever I'm able to, while doing these intake pulse testing. So what am I getting at? We're gonna go ahead and take a look at the waveform and see the results. I've got the waveform already pulled up over here. Hope you guys can see this clearly. Hopefully it's not too much glare. Could turn off this light actually. Maybe that'll help, maybe not. But we're gonna look at the whole thing, right? And I'm gonna explain what we're seeing. Our blue channel is our amperage. That is the starter amperage. We do have a bit of a waviness. That is because of the air issue that we have here. It sounded even, you know, and when you're cranking the vehicle, if I didn't have all that stuff on there, it would sound perfectly even. But due to the waviness, some people might say, well, you can still trust it. I say don't. I say don't trust cranking amperage by itself. The red waveform is the intake, and that is showing a very negative pull because of that very small opening that we have on that T. And then once I stop cranking it, it's the intake manifold acts as a storage tank and finally releases the pressure slowly, even after I stopped cranking. So what are we looking at here? This is our intake pulse, right? As you can see, we've got 8 rulers here. I'm going to put one ruler right here on this, and we're going to set it up correctly, right? So let me minimize this right here. We're going to set this up correctly. I hope I'm not like really overkilling this explanation here. As you can see, every 8 we get a hump. This is, if you want real details, you're gonna need training from Brandon Steckler or John Thornton or Bernie Thompson. But many of you are already familiar with this from my previous videos. We see a hump, we see an anomaly every 8 compression. Every time, I already know which cylinder it is. Every time number 6 hits, that anomaly presents itself. The whole point really is to show that you can't trust the relative compression test by itself anymore. You will get burned. I am pretty convinced that this is an intake valve issue, intake sealing issue. And the real kicker is that they just did heads on this thing. The whole valve job has been done on this. Has a brand new serviced, not brand new, they have just serviced the heads. So this will have to be warranted. Yeah. And I didn't even follow my own rule on this one. I kind of like, you have to, I think you always have to start with a relative compression test and an intake pulse, because if not, you'll do what I did. It smelled like fuel, it smelled like rotten eggs, which is typical of unburned fuel or excessive fuel making its way through the exhaust system. And I took a look at the secondary ignition, didn't see anything there. The RC test, the clear flood sounded even. So I went for the injection. I did an injector balance test and it passed. So learn from my mistake. Don't fall into that trap. Always start with the relative compression test with an intake pulse, with the crankcase isolated from the intake, and you'll have the results that you can trust. Because realistically, this could really get you. I hope this was useful information to you. I appreciate you all for taking the time to watch. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment. Be sure to hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Thanks for watching. Take care. I've removed all the stuff that I had on there before. Can you make a call out based on that?